More wet pastel techniques. Today I'm going to cover one more way to do an underpainting using wet pastels. Now, in previous episodes we just took our dry pastels and turned them into wet pastels. This time I'm going to use Neo 2 pastels. They're water-soluble pastels from, and I don't speak French, they're made in Switzerland, and it's called Caran de Arche or something like that. So we're going to use these today. Wonderful sets. I don't use these all the time, but sometimes I like to use them, especially on smaller pieces. But look at those beautiful colors, a set of 30. And I loved them so much that I went out and I bought some individual colors. And so I'm going to use these for my underpainting. And then we're going to wet them down because they're water soluble. And we'll show you how you can start to get some of the tonal values and things like that. So let's get started and off we go like a herd of turtles. Okay, today my tools. My favorite brush for underpaintings is the little cheap chip brush. Has very uneven ends. It's 89 cents at my local big box hardware. Then I've got this little cheap hobby brush that is slanted on the edge for any details. So I will probably be using this brush most. I may put some branches in just as a place setter. You guys have seen me do that if you watch my other videos. I make these little place setters that it may not be the right color when I put it in, but by the end of the painting, at least I remember I wanted to put some tree trunks or branches there. So that's what we're using as supplies. This is a 10 by 10 UArt sanded 400. I use UArt 400 for a lot of my work because I bought a roll of it and I just cut it out and I put it on here. This is a piece of scrap of the UArt, and I wanted to show you, having used this pastel color, this kind of lilac color, I put it on, this part on just very lightly using the side of the pastel. Then I used it and pressed really hard. You can still see a few little skips and jumps where the beige paper comes in. And then I made it a little more solid than this, going across this way, but you still see a lot of the beige paper show through. Then I used water on my brush, and I recommend, if you've never used the Neos before, to play with them a little bit on a piece of scrap paper. And I put this water on my brush, and you can see how I can dissolve these little marks, and I get about this much of a wash. Now see how much more intense the color here is? So I know that if I press really hard, I can get more color to wash out, and I can create a dark area that's going to in the future become a dark area and a different color, and I can wash it out into a more transparent wash. This, you can see, I didn't quite like this one. It dissolved all the crayon that was, they call them crayons by the way, the crayon that was in the gaps. This one it doesn't. There's still some of the crayon marks, but it's not important. We're going to cover all that with dry pastel. Okay, so let's get started. This is my source. This is one of my notebooks. I draw from either life out in plein air and bring it back to the studio and work from my drawing, or underneath here are some other drawings. And so I usually have 3 to 4 drawings per page, and a future video will show you how to do all that. So I cover up the ones that are a distraction and lets me focus on this. Now you'll see I've put these little dots to show me where the corners are and the edges, and I've also marked the 1/3 areas because we haven't covered composition. We're not going to here, but the 1/3 where these places intersect and the lines go up and down across here and across here and down here and down here, these are points of interest in composition. So it will give me a reference as I transfer this drawing to the blank page, just looking at these points of reference. Okay, now the colors I'm putting down, I'm going to put this dark tree over here. I'm going to put some of that down in here, and I'm going to press a little bit harder because remember that my sample, the harder I press, the more pigment I'll have left on there, and the more I can move it around and create different tonal values depending on how much I let pool up and things like that. I don't do my underpaintings with a lot of detail. I know some people that use watercolor and acrylics for underpaintings, and these underpaintings, they are a lot of fun, but I like to let things happen, let the art tell me what to do. And so I don't try to get a lot of detail in these underpaintings. I want accidents to happen. Bob Ross, any of you guys remember Bob Ross? He always said happy little accidents, and he's just absolutely right. There's all these little happy little accidents that happen. And like many of my drawings, notice the angle of this. I decided to make it a little less, but now after I've got it down on there, I decided I want to have it a little higher. So I'm going to draw a little line. I like that steeper angle there. I was just afraid that I'd have a triangle the same size up here as I'd have down here, and that's kind of what's there. There's some trees off in the background here. I'm going to use, for my background color, I'm going to use some of these grays and violets. This is a kind of a blue violet, and I'm going to just put some things up in there to make these trees in the background. A little bit of a horizon line between these trees to separate the background. So I just put a little of that gray up in there. Now my sky is not going to be pink, but I like sometimes to have this kind of reddish rose color underneath. And then I add a little bit of whatever my sky color will be over that. And I try to add a little yellow into where I might have some of my brightest. Now that's going to turn green when I mix it, and maybe a little orangish green, but I try to get a little bit of that sunlight, and it won't be yellow also in my finished painting, because if you watch my other videos you get to see that I like to do some layering. This is our foreground, and maybe we got some dry grasses and things in there. I forgot to mention that just because this is sanded paper does not mean that you have to do these things on sanded paper. It's just what I have. It could just as easily, these crayons will stick to any paper, drawing paper with tooth or what have you. And I'm going to put just a little bit different blue on some of the edges. It's a little brighter, a little higher chroma than what I had for these trees that I just blocked in. And I want to get some of that brighter chroma up on top of some of these things. Once it's washed in, I like to start with the lightest colors first, because I'm not going to be switching brushes. And as a result, if I start with the darks and go into my lights, I'll end up with the darker colors dulling down some of the brighter areas that I want. So you can see how this stuff really dissolves really nicely with just a little bit of water. And the more I scrub it, the more it picks up the pigments. This light blue-gray up in the sky, mixing a little bit with those yellows. Like I said, that we're getting some oranges and greens in there. These are the trees that are in the background, so I want to put some points on those. those will eventually become more violet. And as I said earlier, many people like to have a much more detail. So after you do this, you could easily go back after this dries, you could easily go back into these areas with more crayon and the pastel crayon and get more detail. You could start adjusting your color values. There's all sorts of possibilities here that you could do with this that I'm not doing, because this is just my painting method, is to just block in some basic colors and I start to adjust them as the painting progresses. So it's up to you, it's up to each individual artist. Now there's a lot of color pigment here. I didn't have to go near that dark. Look, I get some nice drips and runs, and some of those things can also create those ghosts that some of my other videos talk about putting into your paintings. See how if I mix after being in those darks, but I didn't like as bright as that was down in there. So you can see I've got some nice shapes that match this. I've got a foreground. I've hinted here and here what some of these intrusions are in my drawing. I'm not real happy with my trees. I may forget and think those are just that's sky. So while this is wet, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to create some of those trees that are off in the background, and that will remind me that that's a row of trees off in the distance in the violet light and the dust of the air and things like that as they go back and up the side of a hill. So see how easy that was? This stuff picks up the paint, it's wet, and I'm doing wet pastel into wet pastel wash. So look at that. We can do the same thing down here if I wanted to use if I wanted to mark some of my trees that are a little closer and create some more separation here. I've got a lime green, it's mixing with the blue, so it's lightening some things up. And I can do all sorts of fun little things with these pastels while they're still wet. And I wanted to get that hill, or that at a little bit more of an angle than I had. So we'll go back in here and get some of that orange up in there. That's these little areas right in here. So you see we get some opportunities to put a little more detail in there without going crazy and kind of marrying ourselves to the images that are left there. And I'll get that bright light back up in here. Maybe there's some peeking through there. We can always do that with dry pastel a little bit better sometimes. So that's it. It's a little bit more about how you can use wet underpaintings and wet pastels. Even though they're the soluble Neo 2 pastels, you can work wet into wet, but this will dry and you can put dry pastel over it using what the underpainting is as a guide to inform how you're going to proceed. So until next time, if you like these videos, please hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you in about another week with another subject. Bye-bye. What am I doing today?